The older you get, the more death you see. I don't mean to sound grim. Well, maybe I do. Life is grim sometimes. No matter how good it is, it's still fleeting. You and everyone you know will die one day. Friends, enemies, everything in between. It's kind of funny if you think about it. We're all trying to survive as long as possible, but then we get lonely if we outlive our loved ones, and we start to reach out for those who are left. All that's a long way of prefacing my trip to Boston a few months ago. It was for a reunion, me and my old gang from high school. We do it every few years. Choose a city, meet up, have a few meals, and talk about the members of our pack who are no longer with us. Each time we see one another, there are more folks to talk about. I was coming from Annapolis, so I took the Amtrak up on a Friday morning. I found a seat in a cafe car. I prefer sitting at a table where I can spread out my reading material and smell the crappy burnt coffee getting made. It's comforting. Usually I'm the only one who feels this way because I don't have a seat made very often. But this time, the train was full. So I had to share my table with a guy. He was older. Seemed like he was in that phase of life I just mentioned where he stayed healthy and spry into his 60s. But now here he was, alone on a train. Anyway, we got to chatting. His name was Tom. He'd gotten on the Amtrak in D.C. where he lived. He was a sweet man, shy but attentive, listened to my stories, offered some of his. But he got weird when the train roared through a certain patch of land. Looked nondescript to me, just East Coast woods. But when Tom looked out the window, he went rigid. His eyes got glassy. He said he grew up near here in a Boston suburb called Dover. Hadn't been back in 50 years. He seemed agitated, so I kept it casual. I said that was interesting, asked why he'd left. He looked at me, full of anguish and fear. Despite his haunting glare, I wasn't prepared for what he said next. Without shame or irony, he said, "Because of the demon." You're listening to Run, Fool. I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 55, The Dover Demon. Tom told me he moved to Dover in 1977. He was 12 at the time, and his dad had uprooted them from Florida for some big job opportunity in the Boston area. It was spring when they arrived, but Tom was used to a balmy climate, you know. So when he touched down in the Northeast, the first thing he did was shiver. Anyway, it was just Tom and his dad. His mom passed away a few years ago. He was an only child. Now he was the new kid at school, in a new part of the world. See where I'm going with all this? Tom was lonely as hell. To make matters worse, his Dover classmates seemed to collectively decide Tom was weird, mostly because he was from Florida. To be fair, Bostonians don't trust anyone from outside Boston, no matter where they're from. It wasn't just the Florida thing, though. Tom's vibes were off. He was sad. He missed the sunshine, fresh oranges, Cuban food, his friends, his mom. But it doesn't matter why he was in a funk. The other kids could sense it, and any sign of weakness was blood in the water. After about 2 weeks in the suburbs, Tom had a really rough day at school. It was recess, and he was reading a self-help book called The Plunge. The book was designed to make you feel good about uncertainty and change, instead of panicking. Because according to the author, transition was an opportunity for adventure. Tom was a big self-help guy. Part of it was because his mom had been a big fan of the genre, and it made him feel closer to her. But also, he figured, if he read enough about bravery and optimism, he'd start to believe it. Tom was deeply engrossed in this one chapter of his book when he felt something strange. The skin on the back of his neck got hot. Then, a chill ran down his spine. He realized someone was behind him, literally breathing down his neck. A big, beefy kid named Jimmy loomed over him, which made Tom's heart sink. Jimmy hated him, hated that he was from Florida, that he read books at recess, and that he didn't have a mom. Yeah, Jimmy was a jerk, plain and simple. So it should come as no surprise that Jimmy grabbed Tom's book and threw it on the ground, for no other reason than he wanted Tom to experience pain. Then he lifted a foot, clad in an Adidas Original Superstar, and stomped on it, hard, smushing the pages into the mud, tearing some of them out. That's when Tom did the worst thing he could have done. He burst into tears. I mean, I felt for the kid, but at recess, at this school, tears opened Tom up to intense ridicule. Jimmy started laughing. Some other kids playing nearby stopped what they were doing to laugh too. Even though he knew it was bad, Tom couldn't stop crying. Soon, recess was just a chorus of Tom's wails and students cackling. Tom's dad came to pick him up after that. The car ride home was quiet. Tom could tell his dad was annoyed at having to leave work, so Tom didn't say much. When they got home, Tom got out and headed to the front door. But something stopped him. One of the bushes that lined the walkway rustled, like something was moving inside. Tom waited for some kind of animal to pop out, but nothing did. Instead, he thought he caught a glimpse of a glowing orangey light among the leaves. Actually, there were two sources of light, little balls floating in the bush. They looked like eyes. Tom's dad laid a hand on his shoulder, making him jump. His dad cleared his throat and told Tom to look on the bright side. He'd make friends. He just needed to give it time and toughen up a little more. It was classic bad dad advice. Tom's mom would have hugged him tight and said she understood. She was always on his side, you know? But damn, at that moment, Tom wondered, would anyone ever be on his side again? Tom stayed up late that night reading The Plunge, at least reading what he could. There were a few pages missing from Jimmy's assault. He was under the covers with a flashlight so his dad couldn't see the glare from under the door and tell him to go to sleep. As it got late, Tom's lids grew heavy. Sleep tugged at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't want to go to bed. Not yet. He'd rather read some encouragement from the pages of this book than let his own sullen thoughts take over. But when he felt his head lulled to the side, he knew it was time to call it quits. Just as he was about to turn his flashlight off, a sound cut through the quiet, a loud scraping, like his window was getting pushed open. Tom threw the covers off and waved his flashlight around. The beam landed on the window. There was something pressed against the pane from the outside. It was a palm, a huge one with a greenish tinge to it. Its skin was smushed into the glass, making the whole thing look like some kind of booger. At first, that's what Tom thought it was. Then, the booger hand moved. Its fingers inched towards the bottom of the pane and slowly reached inside the gap between the window and sill. The scraping sound echoed through the room again. The window opened wider. Tom gasped and yanked the covers back over his head. He turned off the light, heart pounding. He grinded his teeth together to stop them from rattling, tried everything he could to suppress his panicked breaths as he listened to the window open all the way, and heard something crawl inside. Tom didn't see what it was, but he could hear it. Soft little pattering of footsteps ran around his room. A coo broke through the quiet. Then a scratching sound. His bed rattled as something pushed it. Tom bit his lip, suppressing a scream. He had no idea what was in his room. A person? An animal? Something else? He wanted to yell out for his dad, but he just told Tom to toughen up. If he called his dad in and the creature was just a squirrel or something, he'd be even more disappointed in Tom than he already was. So Tom just stayed there, rigid, terrified, trying not to breathe or move. Then he heard his bedroom door open. With a creak, a patter of footsteps followed. Sounded like the thing was going into the hallway. So Tom felt safe enough to take a peek. He slowly pulled back his covers and came face to face with a pair of orange bloodshot eyes. Tom was frozen in shock. For just a second, All he could do was stare into those mesmerizing orbs. But after that second passed, Tom was hit with a visceral wave of fear. He yelped and swung his arm. He could feel his elbow connect with the creature before it soared through the air and disappeared over the side of the bed. A loud thud echoed through the room as the creature hit the ground. Tom scrambled up, looking for a weapon. He lunged for his book, The Plunge, held it over his head as he moved to the side of the bed. There was nothing there. Tom looked around. The room was dark, shadowy, and very, very quiet. He stood up on his mattress to get a better view, but couldn't see anything on the floor around him. Then he heard something, a raspy, wheezing sound. It was coming from under the bed. Tom's mouth went dry. He sank to his knees, grabbed his flashlight with his trembling hands, and crawled over to the edge of the bed. He leaned down so that he was hanging over the side and could peer underneath the frame. He nervously waved his flashlight, letting its beam cut through the inky darkness until it hit the heinous creature that lurked there. Tom's light illuminated the back of a thin, green-tinged beast. Its skin seemed slick, almost rubbery. From what he could see, the thing was small but not tiny. Tom guessed about 4 feet. He could see every vertebra of its spine as it curled into a tight ball. Its feeble shoulders shook as its body was racked with deep, inconsolable tremors. As if feeling the spotlight, the creature suddenly unfurled itself and whipped around. Those vapid orange peepers flashed at Tom, wide and lethal. They were set in a bulbous melon-shaped head that had nothing but eyes. I mean, nothing. No mouth, no nose. Tom had no idea how the thing was breathing. Then he noticed tears pouring from the corners of its eyes. Whoa. It was crying. Tom's heart kind of melted then, because here was this unearthly, potentially terrifying creature, but it was also alone, in an unfamiliar place, and it seemed really, really scared. I think you can guess where I'm going with this. Whatever this creature was, Tom didn't see a monster. He saw himself. So at that moment, Tom let his guard down. He told the creature it was okay. He wasn't going to hurt it. The thing didn't move. Tom went to the floor and bent over. He offered a hand. The creature just looked at him, like it was appraising the situation. Then it crawled forward. Its willowy arms ate up the floor as it made its way to the edge of the bed. Then its green-tinged fingers curled around the frame, and it pulled itself out. Once it stood, Tom felt a shiver rush through him. He briefly wondered if he was being an idiot, and this thing was going to rip him apart, because it looked really strong. Its arms were lanky, but he could see muscles ripple under the tight skin. Its long fingers looked like they could easily wrap around his throat and squeeze. It cocked its head, staring at Tom with those unsettling eyes, like it was assessing its next move. Tom assessed it right back. This creature didn't look like any animal he'd ever seen, but it wasn't a person either. An alien, maybe? It sort of reminded Tom of a demon he'd seen in a comic book once, which should have made him scared. But for once, he decided to embrace what he'd learned from the plunge. Instead of being terrified of uncertainty and change, he was going to see it as an adventure. Tom reasoned that all living things need food, right? There was an old half-eaten grilled cheese on his nightstand, so he offered it to the demon. The creature snatched it. For a moment, Tom wondered how it was going to eat. It didn't have a mouth, but that question was answered a second later, when a hole appeared in the creature's face. It grew wider and wider and wider, until his entire head was a gaping pit of darkness, lined by razor-sharp, dingy teeth. It shoved the grilled cheese inside, and the hole quickly closed, like it had never been there at all. Tom listened to the creature chew up the bread. Its cheeks puckered and oscillated until it swallowed. It cocked its head at Tom again, then reached over and grabbed the plunge from where Tom had dropped it on the bed. It gently caressed the cover, then held out the book. It was asking Tom to read. Now, this was the start of what my grandma used to call a kindred connection. It's where two people, or things, find themselves drawn to one another, even if it seems crazy or impossible. Here was an otherworldly creature and a lonely boy, sharing a singular sweet moment together that would come to define their lives. No one else could understand that moment but the two of them. Tom stayed up all night reading to Monty. That was his new name, short for demon. They talked a lot, too. Well, Tom did. But even though Monty couldn't say anything, he seemed to understand Tom. And Tom finally had someone to confide in. He told Monty about the mean kids in his class, how he missed his mom and wished his dad were around more. He tried to be brave like the plunge said. But it was hard. Tom would have talked to Monty even longer, but at some point, he heard a door slam, somewhere in the house. Tom and Monty's heads shot towards the noise. Tom knew that sound. His dad had just gone into the bathroom for his daily shower, which meant it was morning already. Monty seemed agitated by this. The creature was staring at the door. His entire body was tense. Tom told Monty it was okay, which seemed to relax the demon a bit. But there was a big problem. Tom had school today and he had no idea what to do with Monty while he was gone. So once his dad got out of the shower, Tom poked his head out of his room and told his dad the only logical thing he could think of. He was sick. His dad didn't buy it, of course. He thought Tom just didn't want to go back to school, that he was too much of a scaredy cat to face the bullies from yesterday. So within the hour, Tom found himself being forced into his dad's car and shuttled off to school. I mean, he could have told his dad about Monty. Who knows why kids don't like telling their parents that kind of thing? Maybe it was because Tom didn't think his dad understood him. So why would he understand Monty? At school, Tom walked around in a fog. He even ignored Jimmy when the bully tried to make fun of him in the hall, because Tom wasn't thinking about anything but Monty, and whether or not his new friend would be there when he got home. All that's to say, when lunchtime hit, Tom couldn't take it anymore. He did something he'd never done in his life. He cut school. Yeah, he ran all the way back home, which wasn't far, by the way, maybe a half a mile. He was so focused on his destination, he didn't realize he was being followed. Not until he opened his front door and heard someone whistle behind him. He turned and saw Jimmy standing at the end of the walkway, along with 3 intimidating meatheads, who all looked a few grades older than they actually were. They demanded to know why Tom had ignored them all day. Tom didn't say anything, didn't want to agitate them even more, but his silence pissed them off too. The kids advanced. Jimmy raised a fist. Tom knew if he didn't go inside, he'd get clobbered. But before he could move, something shot out of his door, towards the bullies. It went so fast he didn't see what it was until the thing latched onto Jimmy's shoulders, and he realized it was Monty. He was only relieved for a second. That's how long it took Monty to open his mouth, exposing his pitch-black gullet and the toothy daggers that lined his gums. Then, Monty wrapped his wretched lethal maw around Jimmy's head. This was what Tom was looking at. Jimmy stood there, just as he had before. Only his entire head was covered by Monty's mouth. The demon's drool-covered lips encircled Jimmy's neck. His jaws and throat undulated, sucking, feeding. Jimmy's arms twitched. Tom was sure he was screaming, but it was quiet, because the bully's mouth and airways were covered by Monty's bite. Then, Tom heard a sound he'll never forget. An electric, deafening noise that made his whole body recoil. It was a loud crack of bone as Monty's jaws clamped down and wrenched Jimmy's head off. A spray of hot, thick blood hit Tom in the face as he watched the headless Jimmy crumple to the ground. A loud crunch filled the air. Monty chewed up Jimmy's head. Tom was stunned. Of course he was. It was horrible. And for a second, he was surprised that none of Jimmy's friends were screaming. A look up told him why. They were gone. He saw their backs sprinting down the road, not a sight. Probably started running before their friend even hit the ground. Tom felt his chest get tight as he looked at Monty still chewing the remnants of Jimmy's head, working through that skull and everything in it. See, Tom was having a hard time because he was terrified, right? I mean, Monty had just ripped off someone's head and ate it like a Dorito. But also, when Monty looked up at Tom, his orange eyes were full of affection. Monty wasn't evil. He was an animal. Sometimes animals have instincts we can't begin to understand. I mean, if we're going there, so do humans. I digress. All that's to say, Tom was nauseated by what happened to Jimmy, but it didn't make him hate Monty. And he knew if anyone saw what his demon had done, they'd take him away. So Tom grabbed Jimmy's ankles and started pulling him towards his open garage. He didn't have a plan. He just knew that he had to get this dead body out of sight. Fast. Monty cocked his head, made some kind of cooing sound, then ran around to help Tom pull. It was wild, but even as Tom was panicking about the corpse on his lawn, he felt grateful that he and Monty were in this together. The garage was just a few yards away. He and Monty had barely gotten Jimmy inside when he heard another terrible sound. A car pulling into the driveway. It was his dad. Tom's father parked and shot out of the car, yelling about how he'd gotten a call from school, that Tom cut class. His dad didn't notice the body. He didn't notice Monty either, because the demon had disappeared behind a bush near the walkway. Tom was unsettled by Monty's departure. See, he understood that Monty attacked Jimmy when he was threatening Tom. Right now, his dad was yelling. He hoped Monty understood the difference. Before he could finish that thought, Monty leapt out of the bush. Tom watched the demon arc through the air like he was flying. His arms were spread wide as he soared towards Tom's dad. Tom cried out as Monty landed on his dad's shoulders, slick green arms wrapped around his dad's neck, and that terrifying face hole began to open. Tom sprinted forward. He grabbed a hold of Monty and tried to yank him off, but it was useless. Monty's grip was tight, unbreakable. Tom's dad was screaming, swatting at Monty, which only made the demon hiss with fury. His mouth was wide open now, revealing ragged chompers, covered in bloody residue from Jimmy's guts. Tom could only watch on in horror until a loud bang cracked through the air and Monty dropped like a lead balloon. A dozen men in suits stormed up the driveway. A fleet of black, indistinct vans were parked on the street. Tom hadn't even heard them arrive. One of the suits carried a cage. Another had a tranquilizer gun, aimed at Monty's limp form on the grass. These guys were obviously government cronies. Tom could tell, and he understood they were there for Monty. It only took a few seconds for the suits to swarm all over Tom's house. Some men picked up Monty and placed him in a cage. Some took samples around the yard. Others spoke to his panic-stricken dad. A few gently tended to Jimmy. Yeah, they were the cleanup, or the cover-up, I should say. They told Tom enough for him to make sense of what had happened. Monty had escaped from a highly classified lab in the area. They didn't say what Monty actually was, like whether he was a demon or alien or something else. That wasn't important, not even to Tom. All they say is that they've been tracking him for a while. It was too bad they hadn't gotten to him before, well, Jimmy was a casualty. Tom and his dad were instructed to keep this whole ordeal a secret. If they told anyone, the government would know, and they'd retaliate. During this debrief, Tom watched the suits load Monty into one of the vans. His heart ached, because even though the demon had killed Jimmy and tried to kill his dad, Monty was his friend. He looked out for Tom, but no one else would. So, it was a loss, a deep one, and Tom wasn't sure he'd ever be the same. Tom looked out the window. Tears filled his eyes. He wiped them away, but I saw them. I understood this story was one of those catch-alls. See, there are certain parts of your life you pin everything on. Your pain, your lack of success, your fear of abandonment. That stuff. If I was right, from then on, every bad choice Tom made, or hardship he faced, he blamed on the moment he watched Monty getting hauled away. Tom went on to say a few teens in Dover had seen Monty, probably before he got to Tom's place. They drew sketches of him and got word out that there was a demon on the loose, or an alien. Some assumed the teens had misidentified an animal, like an owl or something. Some people thought it was a hoax. Tom knew the truth, though. The demon existed, and it was his friend. Tom leaned in, like he was confiding in me. He said he wasn't supposed to tell anyone, but he was allowed to visit Monty. He'd gotten moved to a high-security cage in D.C. It was hard for Tom to see him like that. But you know what? Tom still didn't have that many friends, and it's important to hang on to the ones you got. I understood that. The value of spending time with the friends you had left, the people who really know you. Because like I said, life is fleeting, and there's no need to spend our brief time on this earth alone. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and produced by Abakar Adan. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Coordinating producer is Avery Siegel. Artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levy. Executive producer at Will Media is Will Malnati. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.